one of the great issues of our time, the immigration bill that is before us, and I thank the ranking member, Mr. Grassley, for allowing me to jump ahead of him in the schedule. I have a markup in the Armed Services Committee that I need to get back to. But let me say that in the next few weeks, the Senate will have an opportunity to discuss clearly and resolutely America's broken immigration system. Part of that means seeking policy solutions that will not only make our country stronger for decades to come, but make our country safer going forward. Partisan politics should not derail the pursuit of an honest and good faith approach to solving national problems like our broken immigration system. Americans are right to demand better from their elected representatives, and there is merit in allowing this legislation to proceed in an open and transparent manner. In doing so, we rightfully recognize that there is widespread and bipartisan consensus for lasting immigration reform. That consensus exists in this chamber, Mr. President, and it exists across the country. For that reason, yesterday I voted in favor of cloture on this bill and in favor of the motion to proceed. So here we are about to consider, I hope, amendments that would improve the bill. We cannot ignore the reality that there are 11 million undocumented immigrants in America today. We cannot dismiss the economic implications of a failed immigration system. Disagreements are part of the legislative process, and we will have disagreements over the next several weeks on this issue. I don't expect our work on this issue to be seamless. I don't expect it to be easy, but robust debate has always been central to the Senate's function and purpose. We would do well to uphold that proud tradition now. Lasting and effective immigration reform requires a willingness to work on issues collaboratively and constructively and bipartisanly, Mr. President. An issue of this magnitude that touches on so many aspects of society and our economy cannot be done on a solely partisan basis. We must have a wide, large bipartisan majority for anything that moves out of this body and down to the House. I'm a longtime supporter of reinforcing our borders, of increasing the number of Border Patrol agents and using surveillance technology to prevent illegal immigrants from crossing into our country. I support policies that come with enforcement and accountability, where those who have broken the law face consequences for their wrongdoing. I believe that measures to strengthen employment verification are important to making sure that American jobs are held by American citizens and by those who live and work in our country legally. In my view, the immigration bill prepared by a bipartisan group of 8 and supported by the Judiciary Committee is a start, but it is lacking in many ways, and I cannot support it in its current form. More should be done to ensure, first and foremost, that our borders are secure. Without this fundamental first step, true reform remains elusive and the problem of illegal immigration will persist. As we proceed with this bill, I look forward to amendments that would implement a stronger border security strategy, interior security protections, and processes for honest employers to assess the employees' work rights. A responsible way forward must recognize past failures, and we've certainly seen that. Past failures, for example, to secure the border, unfulfilled promises for better enforcement. We need to recognize those failures of the past. A comprehensive plan must include mechanisms to track those who unlawfully overstay their visas, just as it seeks to remedy gaps in border security. Over the course of the past few weeks, Mississippians have contacted my office and spoken to me directly regarding their concerns about whether the bill will offer amnesty, whether it will offer federal benefits to illegal immigrants. Let me be clear that I will oppose legislation if it grants legal status without penalties, or if it issues welfare benefits to individuals who have broken the law to live and work in this country. These individuals should not go to the front of the line, ahead of those who have patiently waited to become Americans. We are a country of immigrants. Throughout American history, people of all nations have recognized the promise of opportunity and freedom in the United States. Legal immigration has sustained and advanced our communities in a positive way. Whether our immigration system going forward works in a way that benefits our society depends on how we act in the coming weeks. I hope we can do so thoughtfully and meaningfully as we seek solutions to a flawed system. This bill in its current form does not contain the reforms we need. Efforts to amend it should be seen as an opportunity to get a bipartisan consensus of senators to a yes vote. They shouldn't be seen as poison pills or as efforts to hurt the process. This bill serves as a vehicle for continued discussion about the future of U.S. immigration policy. We should welcome this debate, and I do welcome this debate. And we should confront the challenges of our day in a way that is deliberative and principled. Thank you, Mr. President. And I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Iowa.
Thank you. I suppose that when those of us that raise a lot of questions about this legislation and we point out shortcomings in it, that some question about sincerity when we say we need a piece of legislation might be questioned by a lot of people that are listening. And it may also sound like we question the sincerity of the group of 8, this bill that we have before us, that they worked hard to put together when we raise questions about it. And I don't question their sincerity, and I do believe that a piece of legislation must pass the United States Senate. Those of us that have said for such a long time that the system we have is not satisfactory, you can't maintain the status quo, we've got to be working for a product. And all of us in the United States Senate are working towards a product. There's a difference of what that product should be in the final analysis. So I continue to come to the floor to raise some questions about not the intent of the authors, but what I think is the practical effect of the authors of this legislation. So I come to the floor today to respond to what my friend, the senior senator from Arizona, said earlier today on this legislation. And he's one of those hard-working senators that have worked hard, hours I'm sure I can't comprehend, to put together this piece of legislation. So today, that senator argued that poll after poll shows American support of legalization process if, and that's a very important if, people pay back taxes, pay a fine, and get at the end of the line, and if we secure the border. Well, I've pointed out before that the problem with the legislation before us, as well intended, is that people don't really have to pay back taxes or a fine or go to the end of the line and secure the border. So these polls are being misused if the practical effect of the language in the bill makes it possible that those things may never happen, even though it's well intended that they ought to happen. And nobody disagrees that they ought to happen. So I would probably be somewhat repetitive, but I want to remind my colleagues, as I take a few minutes to discuss how the authors have tried to sell this particular immigration bill and what I see as false advertising. You see, the American people are being sold a product. In fact, that's what politics is. It's a sale of ideas. A political party doesn't have any reason to exist if it doesn't have good ideas. And then the idea is to get in a position to put those ideas into effect. Well, this product is being sold, and I wish it comes out exactly the way they say it does, but I have questions about that. So the American people are being asked to accept a legalization program, and in exchange they'd be assured that the laws were going to be enforced. Normally, consumers are able to read the labels of things that they're about to purchase. They have to read 1,175 pages to really know what's truly in this bill. And even a quick read of the bill would have many shaking their heads in confusion. And this bill is full of delegations of authority to the Secretary, possibilities for waivers, things of that nature, that really it'll be well down the road after the President signs legislation that you're going to really know how it's being carried out. Now, you've all heard the phrase that the devil's in the details. At first, the proposal that the bipartisan group put forward sounded reasonable. But we need to examine the fine print and take a closer look at what the bill really does. As I noted yesterday, I thought the framework held hope, but I realize that the assurances that the group of 8 made didn't really translate into when the language of the bill emerged. They professed that the border would be secured and that people would, quote unquote, earn their legal status. However, the bill as drafted is legalization first and enforcement later, if at all. So I'd like to dive into these details and give a little reality check to those who expect this bill to do exactly what the authors promise. So I have on the chart here 4 points that I'd like to make and statements that have been made about this legislation. Number one, they say, quote, people will have to pay a penalty, end of quote, to obtain legal status. Now, the reality is that the bill lays out the application procedures, and on page 972, a penalty is imposed on those who apply for registered provisional immigration status. That's the words in the bill for legalization. We refer to that as RPI. It says that those who apply must pay $1,000 to the Department of Homeland Security. Now, what's the certainty of getting that $1,000? For instance, it waives the penalty for anyone under the age of 21. Yet on the next page, it allows the applicant to pay the penalty in installments. The bill says, quote, the Secretary shall establish a process for collecting payments that permit the penalty to be paid in periodic installments that shall be completed before the alien may be granted an extension of status, end of quote. In effect, this says that the applicants have 6 years to pay the penalty. Now, that 6 years is how long it takes to get RPI status, and at the end of 6 years, you have to extend it. In addition to the penalty, applicants would pay a processing fee. Now, that level is set by the Secretary. So here you got 2 instances of of excessive delegation of authority to the Secretary. The bill says that the Secretary has the discretion to waive the processing fee for any quote-unquote class of individuals she chooses and may limit the maximum fee paid by a family. The bill doesn't require everyone, then, to pay a penalty. It doesn't require anyone to pay it when they apply for legal status. In fact, they may never have to pay a penalty. Number two, people, quote unquote, people have to pay back taxes. Now, who's going to argue with the fact that people have to pay back taxes to receive legal status? The reality, members of the Group of Eight stated over and over again that their bill would require undocumented individuals to pay back taxes prior to being granted legal status. However, the bill before us fails to make good on that promise. Proponents of the bill point to a provision of the bill that prohibits people from filing for legal status, quote, unless the applicant has satisfied an applicable federal tax liability, end of quote. Now, doesn't that sound right? Absolutely, it sounds right. But as always, the devil's in the details. There are two important weaknesses with how the bill defines applicable federal tax liability. The first one is the bill limits the definition to exclude employment taxes such as for Social Security and Medicare. Now, for a lot of people, that may be the only taxes they pay, but you don't have to pay Social Security and Medicare taxes. Second, the bill does not require the payment of all back taxes legally owed. What it requires is the payment of taxes previously assessed by the Internal Revenue Service. Well, there's a lot of problems with people, with the IRS assessing somebody for taxes if they've been in the underground, just as an example. So in order to assess taxes, it's quite obvious. The IRS first must have information on which to base its assessment. Our tax system is largely a voluntary system, relying upon everybody to self-report their income on their tax return. But it also relies on certain third-party reporting, such as wage reporting by employers. That's why we get a W-2 form at the end of every year, so that the IRS knows and we know exactly what we owe and what we paid and figure out what more we might owe or how much we might get back. Now, if someone has been working unlawfully in this country and working off the books, it is likely that neither an individual return or a third-party return will even exist. Thus, no assessment will exist and no taxes will be paid. Similarly, it is very unlikely that any assessment will exist for those who have worked under a false Social Security number and have never filed a tax return. A legal obligation exists to pay taxes on all income from whatever source derived, and nothing in this bill provides a requirement or a mechanism to accomplish this prior to granting legal status. One of the group of 8 members in January said, quote, shouldn't citizens have to pay back taxes? Question mark. We can trace their employment back. It doesn't take a genius, end of quote. Well, maybe a well-intended statement. It obviously meets the test of common sense, but I've just showed you how difficult it is to make that happen. The other side of the aisle, for instance, is going to argue that establishing a requirement for back taxes owed rather than taxes assessed is unworkable and costly. They will also claim that imposing additional tax barriers on this population could prevent undocumented workers and their families from coming forward in the first place. But the sales pitch has been clear. To get legal status, one has to pay their back taxes. So let me provide a reality check. This bill doesn't make good on the promises made. Let's go to the third item on the chart. People will have to learn English, the reality. The bill as drafted is supposed to ensure that new Americans speak a common language. Learning English is a way of new residents to assimilate. This is an issue that is very important to Americans. Immigrants before us made a concerted effort to learn English. The proponents are claiming their bill fulfills this wish. However, the bill does not require people here unlawfully to learn English before receiving legal status or even a green card. Under Section 2101, a person with RPI status who applies for a green card only has to pursue a course of study to achieve an understanding of English and knowledge and understanding of civics. If the people who gain legal status ever apply for citizenship, and some doubt that this will happen to a majority of undocumented population, they would also have to pass an English proficiency exam as required under current law. So yes, after 13 years, one would have to pass an exam, but the bill does very little to ensure that those who come out of the shadows will cherish or use the English language. The reality is that English isn't as much of a priority for the proponents of this bill as they claim it is. The fourth thing on the chart, they say, quote, people won't get public benefits, end of quote, if they choose to apply for legal status. Now, the reality, Americans, you know, are very passionate, compassionate, and generous people. Many people can understand providing some legal status to people here illegally, but one major sticking point for those who question a legalization program is the fact that lawbreakers could become eligible for public benefits and taxpayer subsidies. The authors of the bill understood this. In an attempt to show that those who receive RPI status would not receive taxpayers' benefit, they included a provision that prohibited the population from receiving certain benefits. But there are two major problems with this point in the bill. First, those who receive RPI status will be immediately eligible for state and local welfare benefits. For instance, many states offer cash, medical, food assistance through state-only programs to lawfully present individuals. Second, the bill contains a welfare waiver loophole that could allow those with RPI status to receive federal welfare dollars. The Obama administration has pushed the envelope by waiving the welfare laws. If this loophole isn't closed, they could waive existing law and allow funds provided under the welfare block grant known as temporary assistance for families to be provided to non-citizens. Senator Hatch has an amendment during committee markup that would prohibit the U.S. Department of HHS from waiving various requirements in the temporary assistance to needy family program. His amendment would also prohibit any federal agency from waiving restrictions on eligibility of immigrants for future public benefits. But the reality check for the American people is that there are loopholes and the potential for public benefits to go to those who are legalized under the bill. Again, the devil is in the details, and I hope this reality check will encourage proponents of this bill to fix these problems before the bill is passed by the Senate. The American people deserve truth in advertising. I want to speak about another part of the bill, much shorter than I've just spoken, the provision that deals with the commission. Aside from the claims I just gave on the promises to pay taxes, etc., one of the authors of the immigration bill before us stated early on that if the Department of Homeland Security has not reached 100% awareness and 90% apprehension at the southern border within 5 years, the Secretary would lose control of the responsibility and it will be turned over to a board of governors to get the job done. The fact is that border governors and the commission that they serve with is not going to have any power. That's the point that I'm going to make. There was a lot of talk about how the Secretary would be pushed to fulfill the congressional mandate to secure the border. I pointed out yesterday how this Secretary said, we don't need to secure the border, it's already secured. But at the end of the day, as far as this bill is concerned, the legislative text doesn't match up with the rhetoric. The Border Commission created isn't made up primarily of border governors, doesn't have any real power, and the Secretary isn't held accountable for not getting the job done. Again, false advertising. The bill states that effective control, and those words effective control are the legal language in the bill. The bill states that effective control of the border is the ability to achieve and maintain, quote, persistent surveillance and an effectiveness rate of 90% or higher, end of quote. It defines the effectiveness rate as, quote, the percentage calculated by dividing the number of apprehensions and turnbacks in the sector during a fiscal year by the total number of illegal entries in the sector during such fiscal year, end of quote. First, the bill only states that effective control requires, quote, persistent surveillance, end of quote. It does not require 100% awareness. Second, there is nothing in the bill that turns over the issue of border security to border governors if the department here in Washington, D.C. is unable to secure the border. The bill provides for a commission to be created if the Secretary of Homeland Security tells Congress she has not achieved effective control in all border sections during any fiscal year within 5 years. The Southern Border Security Commission is then created with the primary responsibility to make recommendations to the Secretary. There will be 10 members of the commission, and while border states have a seat at the table, only 4 of the 10 members need to be southern border governors or appointed by them. The members are allowed travel expenses, administrative support. They have to have some knowledge and experience in border security. The commission is required to submit a report to the President, the Secretary, and the Congress with specific recommendations for achieving and maintaining the border security goals established in the bill. The members have 6 months to come up with a plan to achieve what the Secretary failed to do in 5 years. The bill does not grant the Commission any grand or impressive authorities. The bill simply states that the Commission shall make recommendations. Nothing in the bill requires that the recommendations be acted upon or implemented by the administration. The bill provides $2 billion to the Secretary to carry out the recommendations made by the Commission. But again, there's nothing in this bill requiring the Secretary to take any further action on those recommendations. Why not give the Commission then actual authority to enforce border security? Then if you don't do that, why create the Commission at all? In recent years, we in Congress have become accustomed to outsourcing our work. We have a responsibility to legislate. The executive branch has a responsibility to enact. These are basic tenets of government. The Commission called for in this bill is kind of irrelevant. This administration and any future administration must get the job done. No outsourcing to some commission, no excuses. And this is so important because we quote these polls, and I referred to the polls that senior senator from Arizona gave before he made his remarks. They're all based upon certain propositions, well-intended, but not the certainty that they're going to be carried out. and legalization's based on that. And the same for the polls that say people want the border secured. So this commission ought to have some power if the Secretary isn't going to act, but already, you know, the Secretary has the responsibility to see that the border is secured. She's testified that it's secured, more secured than it's ever been. But I think the facts are that it has not been, and we need to do better. And for us to sell this bill to the American people, it's based upon the proposition that the border be secured first and then legalization. I yield the floor.
Thank you. Mr. President, there's very little disagreement about the fact that America's immigration system is broken and in need of reform. For far too long, our immigration system has punished those who would come to this country to pursue their American dream, play by their rules, while rewarding those who do not respect our laws. As a result, our nation is suffering. That's why it's important for this body to have an open and transparent amendment process as we move forward on this immigration reform legislation, try to fix what's broken with our immigration system. And no state feels the impact of this broken immigration system more than my home state of Nevada. Nevada is a top destination for travelers all over the world and is an international hub through which tens of millions of people pass each year. Our state benefits from the cultural diversity of Filipino, Cuban, Chinese, and Armenian communities, just to name a few, and we are couched between two states that border the country of Mexico. Las Vegas is known for McCarran International Airport, which sees tens of millions of international tourists each year and is merely a short drive away from Los Angeles, San Diego, and Phoenix. Nevada's unique location leaves it highly vulnerable to our flawed immigration system and open to this exact same problems faced by other southwestern border states like Arizona, Texas, California, and New Mexico. But despite the fact that Nevada is, in many respects, a border state that copes with the exact same immigration problems facing states like California, this bill in its current form excludes Nevada from the list of states that are eligible to join the Southern Border Security Commission. So my amendment, Heller 1227, would include Nevada with other southwestern border states whose governors would comprise the Southern Border Security Commission. This amendment ensures that the commission created in the underlying bill is fully representative of issues affecting southern border and southwestern states. Although Nevada does not touch the southern border, its current demographics and state issues are reflective of other southern border states, and Nevada should have a voice on this commission. Mr. President, the problems of our immigration system are not simply geographic problems of latitude and longitude. They impact my home state in profound ways. I encourage my colleagues to support this common sense amendment. As I've said, this immigration reform legislation is important, and we have an opportunity to provide much-needed solutions to the problems with our immigration system. But we must also ensure that the bill does not make matters worse by creating more confusion and placing heavier burdens on the economy and on the American people. My home state of Nevada continues to lead the nation in high unemployment, bankruptcies, and foreclosures. It's absolutely critical that this immigration bill does not hinder Nevada's already struggling economy. That's why I filed two amendments, Heller 1234 and 1235, which will help to safeguard Nevada's recovering tourism industry in a way that meets our nation's border security needs. The bill before us today mandates the implementation of an entry-exit system that will include a biometric data system for all ports of entry, including the 10 highest volume airports. The implementation of such a system is long overdue in order to comply with current law, but we can take steps to make sure it does not negatively impact international travel. While I firmly believe that we need to process our visitors both in and out of this country safely and securely, it is also essential that this mandatory exit system not cause increased travels, delays at international passengers at high-volume airports like McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas. So I filed an amendment that will require DHS to submit a report to Homeland Security and Government Reform Committee within 60 days of the enactment of the underlying bill, detailing how DHS intends to implement this biometric exit system. Requiring DHS to outline its implementation plan will provide the necessary guidance and clarity to airports that will first be required to comply with the system, as well as ensuring they provide the necessary staffing at these airports in an effort to minimize the impact on the flow of travelers. Additionally, Heller 1235 will require DHS to create a wait time reduction goal and increases deemed necessary by the Department the number of Customs and Borders Protection officers so that airports with high volumes of international travelers can process them in a timely manner. Under this amendment, DHS will be required to develop a viable plan to reduce wait times by 50% at airports with the highest volumes of international travelers. Wait times for international visitors at McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas are already significantly high, largely due to a lack of Customs and Border Protection officers. This amendment will help to alleviate these wait times, help to reduce the congestion that is discouraging travel and ultimately hurting our economy. Mr. President, the underlying bill is far from perfect, but as General George Patton famously said, a good plan executed today is better than a perfect plan executed next week. The amendments I'm filing today will increase government transparency and help to make sure that this bill does not add more confusion to the immigration process, which would only make the problems with our immigration system worse. I urge my colleagues to join me in that effort by supporting these amendments, and with that, Mr. President, I yield back the floor. Thank you.
The Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, let me start by complimenting the Senator from Nevada on his concerns with regard to staffing at our ports of entry, airports, seaports. We have the similar challenges even at our land ports in Texas, where legitimate commerce and tourism is taking place, but which is being inhibited because of or hardship or inconvenience on travelers because of the lack of staffing and infrastructure at those ports of entry. Mr. President, I've come to the floor to talk today about an amendment that I intend to offer, which I have discussed over the last couple of days, which uses many of the same standards that the underlying Gang of Eight bill does. And let me explain. Of course, the Gang of Eight is the Republicans and the Democrats who came up with the original framework that then was adopted by and large by the Judiciary Committee, which is the base bill that we are talking about today. But both the Gang of Eight bill and the Results Amendment, which I will introduce, call for the Department of Homeland Security to achieve 100% situational awareness of the southern border in 10 years. Both the Gang of Eight bill and the Results Amendment that I will introduce call for the Department of Homeland Security to achieve full operational control of the border, which is defined as 90% apprehension rate of illegal traffic. Both the Gang of Eight bill and the Results Amendment, which I will offer, call for a nationwide E-Verify system, or a system of employer verification. So we don't have our employers, small and large alike, have to be the police. We can give them a system that will be easily implemented, card swiped alike, which will allow them to determine and satisfy themselves that the worker who presents themselves for work is legally qualified to work in the United States. And both the Gang of Eight bill, the underlying bill, and the Results Amendment, which I will introduce, call for a biometric entry-exit system at America's largest airports. So, in other words, rather than a poison pill, if my amendment is a poison pill, as some have suggested, then the Gang of Eight bill itself is a poison pill. But neither is true. The most important difference between my amendment and the Gang of Eight bill is that my amendment has real border security triggers in place, while the Gang of Eight bill has no effective trigger that will guarantee implementation of border security standards that reach the gang's own standards of 100% situational awareness, 90% apprehension rate. The Gang of Eight bill endorses many of the same border security standards that my amendment does, but it also authorizes a permanent legalization program for illegal immigrants regardless of whether the United States-Mexico border is ever secured. In other words, it's another promise that Congress is making to the American people, but the American people have no way of knowing whether that promise will ever be kept. Well, as further indication that really what I'm trying to do in my amendment is consistent with what the Gang of Eight has proposed, here's a quote from the Majority Whip, Senator Durbin from Illinois, on January 2013. He said their bipartisan framework for comprehensive immigration reform, in that bill, a pathway to citizenship needs to be contingent upon securing the border. But yesterday, as reported in National Journal on June the 11th, Senator Durbin said the gang has, quote, delinked the pathway to citizenship and border enforcement, close quote. What my amendment would do would be to restore this contingency, which, if the gang's own standards are met, which I believe they will be, will allow people to transition from RPI status, registered provisional immigrant status, to legal permanent residency if they comply with the other requirements of the law. My amendment would delay permanent legal status until after we have that 100% situational awareness along the border and full operational control and nationwide E-Verify and a national biometric entry-exit system at all air and sea ports where Customs and Border Protection are currently deployed. Now, some have said that my amendment and standards of my amendment are unattainable, or some said it's just too expensive. And let me answer both of those criticisms. If the standards that the Gang of Eight has set themselves for situational awareness and operational security are unattainable, then why did they embrace those standards in their own bill? Again, the only difference between my amendment and their initial proposal is that my amendment creates a trigger or a contingency requiring that standard to be met before immigrants who qualify for registered provisional immigrant status can transition into a legal permanent residency status. It's also been claimed by some of our colleagues who interestingly were speaking without having actually seen language in the bill that somehow the cost of my amendment is just too high. The fact of the matter is this bill appropriates $8.3 billion to pay for into a trust fund that's created by the underlying legislation. It's called, on page 872 of the bill, it's called the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Trust Fund, and the initial funding is $8.3 billion. If my colleagues will simply read the legislation in my proposal, my amendment, the funding for my amendment comes from that same trust fund and does not appropriate any other additional funds. And so I'm satisfied by merely reallocating those funds in a way that I believe will help the Department of Homeland Security, help Congress, help the United States government, make sure that we keep our promises to the American people. Well, you don't need to take my word for it, Mr. President. The Washington Post recently asked a number of immigration experts whether the goals set out in the Gang of Eight bill and in my amendment are in fact attainable. And one of them, Asa Hutchinson, a name that's familiar to many of us because he served as a member of Congress, a member of the Drug Enforcement Administration, and an Undersecretary of Border and Transportation Security at the Department of Homeland Security. He told the Washington Post that the border security requirements in my amendment are both reasonable and attainable. And in fact, Hutchinson said my amendment, quote, only requires security measures that are attainable in the near future, close quote. Another expert, Cato Institute scholar Alex Nowrasteh, who's a strong supporter of the underlying Gang of Eight bill, he said my amendment is very much in the vein of the rest of the bill. He also affirmed that it would be indeed attainable or possible for the federal government to attain that 90% apprehension rate along the southern border. As for the biometric entry-exit system and the E-Verify requirements, if the nationwide biometric entry-exit system at our airports and seaports is unrealistic, then somebody should have told President Clinton in 1996 when he signed such a requirement into law. And that is really the problem that my amendment is designed to serve, Mr. President. It has been the law of the land that Congress and the federal government implement a biometric entry-exit system for people entering our country and leaving our country since 1996. But you know what? It's never been done. After the tragedy of 9/11, where 3,000 Americans lost their lives on that terrible day, the 9/11 Commission itself undertook a comprehensive study of how do we stop such a terrible tragedy from occurring again, and what they recommended again is a biometric entry-exit system. But while the biometric entry system is in place, it's just fingerprints on a fingerprint reader, pretty quick, easy technology, relatively cheap. There has been no implementation at the airports and seaports of an exit system, which would tell us when people have entered legally but then have illegally overstayed their visa, which is 40% of illegal immigration. Well, and I would just close on this, on the E-Verify component. This, of course, is the employment verification system. If that's unrealistic, then somebody should have told our friends on the Gang of Eight, because the E-Verify language in their bill is identical with my amendment. But here's the bottom line and the reality. Without a border security trigger, immigration reform will be dead on arrival in the House of Representatives. My amendment provides such a trigger. The Gang of Eight bill does not. That doesn't mean my amendment is a full-scale alternative to the Gang of Eight bill, but it does mean that my amendment is essential to moving this legislation forward and to getting an outcome that ultimately will end up on the President's desk. I believe that we should try to do our best to improve this underlying bill. My amendment is in that spirit because I do believe that the status quo is simply unacceptable, as I believe almost virtually all of our colleagues do. If we don't guarantee results on border security, particularly at a time when skepticism about Washington is at an all-time high, we guarantee the failure of bipartisan immigration reform, and that would be a tragedy. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The Senator from New York.
Well, thank you, and I thank my colleague from Texas for his specifics there, and I know he is trying to make the bill a better bill. I have to say, as I understand it, this is the very same amendment that was defeated in committee. It was defeated by a bipartisan vote of 12-6. It was defeated for two reasons. And let me take a step back. But the two reasons are, one, its cost goes through the roof, and there's no way to pay for it in the Cornyn amendment. It is estimated it could be, in the original amendment, as much as $25 billion. Now, maybe the number of border agents was reduced. I don't know if my colleague has done that or not. But that is a huge expense, and an unnecessary expense, because our bill proposal that is before us does a huge amount on border security for a much lower cost. $25 billion is a lot of money. And second, we do have triggers in our bill, but they are achievable and specific, because this bill is a careful compromise. We want to do two things. We want to have border security, absolutely. And I've always said a watchword of this bill is that the American people will be fair and have a common-sense approach to both future legal immigration and the 11 million who are living here in the shadows, provided and only provided we prevent future waves of illegal immigration. We do that in three ways. One is the E-Verify system. We both agree that that should be in place before there's a path to citizenship. One is fixing up exit entry. The way my colleague has fixed up exit entry, it could take 20 or 25 years before it's in place. We cannot should not, and will not tell those who have waited in the shadows for so long that they should wait for 25 years. And those are the estimates. We can do this on the ports and in the air, but we need a better system, which we have worked on, for land entry. And finally, at the border itself, we've put a large amount of money in there. We've been guided by Senators McCain and Flake, because the Arizona border has more people passing through it than any other, as to what we should do. We emphasize the ability to put in new technologies, drones, who can track everybody who crosses the border and track them inland. We do it for a lot less money. But unfortunately, one of the triggers that my colleague, my good friend from Texas, has put in place would make a path to citizenship, even if all the metrics, the other metrics were put in place, iffy. Possibly yes, possibly no. That is unacceptable. We need to do both. And should there be a new person who comes into office, should there be a different Senate, a different House, under my colleague from Texas's proposal, not one single person could achieve citizenship, even if we had improved the border in many, many different ways. And so I would say to my colleagues, we certainly want to improve the border, but we cannot improve that border and put in place triggers that are not specific and achievable. You can measure whether there are 20 drones at the border. You can measure whether we have X miles of fence. But if you say then that it has to be at this certain rate every year, you're taking away that path to citizenship through no fault of those who have tried to implement tougher border security. And so I'd say to my colleague, we cannot accept his amendment, plain and simple. We welcome proposals on border security. I know there are many on the other side. I've spoken to 4 or 5 who are working on those proposals. But the very same amendment, the very same proposal that was defeated in committee by a bipartisan vote of 12-6 is not going to revitalize an immigration bill, which has plenty of life already. It's not going to strengthen a bill. It could indeed kill it. And so
Yield for a question.
I would urge that we go back to the drawing boards. If the senator from Texas has a different proposal, obviously I would look at it. This one is unfortunately one that we have tried, rejected, and will not lead to either comprehensive immigration reform in the broader sense or a path to citizenship in the most immediate sense.
Mr. President, would the senator yield for a question?
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I'm happy to allow the colloquy between the two senators, questions or otherwise, but I have a consent agreement that Senator Grassley and I have been waiting here to do for some time. And so when we complete our work, I would hope the two senators would engage in whatever conversation they want. Senator, I've also been told that perhaps Senator Leahy, the manager of this bill, may want to say something. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following amendments be in order to be called up before the Senate. Thune number 1197, Vitter number 1228, Landry number 1222, and Landry number 1222, and Tester number 1198. That the time until 4:30 be equally divided between the two managers or their designees for debate on these amendments, and that Grassley amendment at 1195. Let's do that again, Mr. President. That the time until 4:30 be equally divided between the two manager or designees, and that would be for debate on these amendments. And the Grassley amendment, 1195. At 4:30, we proceed to vote on that matter. It would be in relation to the Grassley amendment that upon disposition of the Grassley amendment, the Senate proceed to vote on the 4 amendments in this agreement in the order listed. That there be no secondary amendments in order prior to the votes. That all 5 amendments be subject to a 60 affirmative vote threshold. That there be 2 minutes equally divided between the votes. All after the first vote be 10-minute votes.
Is there objection to this request?
I object.
Mr. President,
It's my understanding the senator
Would
has
the
a-
senator yield?
Yes, my friend has a consent agreement. I understand he wants to propose.
I ask unanimous consent that the pending Grassley amendment be set aside and the following amendments be in order to be called up. Thune, 1197, Vitter, 1228, Landrieu, 1222, and Tester, 1198. That the time until 4 p.m. be equally divided between the two managers or their designees for debate in relationship to the pending Grassley Amendment 1195 and pending Leahy Amendment 1183. Further, I ask that at 4 p.m. the Senate proceed to vote in relationship to the Grassley Amendment, that upon disposition of the Grassley Amendment, the Senate proceed in relationship to the Leahy Amendment, that there be no second-degree amendments in order prior to the votes, and that there be 2 minutes equally divided in between the votes.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Reserving the right to object. I'm somewhat surprised at this request. How many times have we heard the Republican leader say on this floor and publicly that the new reality in the United States Senate is 60? So I just thought I was following the direction of the majority leader, the Republican leader. I mean, this is what he said, that that's why we're having 60 votes on virtually everything. And with this bill, no one can in any way suggest this bill is not important and these amendments aren't important. So I care a great deal about my friend, the ranking member of this committee, but I object.
would the senator
The
from
objection is heard to both requests.
President, the senator from Nevada yield to me?
Yeah, just,
Well, it's amazing to me that the majority has touted this immigration bill process as one that is open and regular order. But right out of the box, right now, just on the third day, they want to subject our amendments to a filibuster like 60-vote threshold. So I have to ask, who's obstructing now? There's no reason, particularly in this first week, at the beginning of the process, to be blocking our amendments with a 60-vote margin that's required when you suppose there's a filibuster. Let's at least start out with regular order. Otherwise, it really looks like the fix is in and the bill's rigged to pass basically as it is. Bottom line, you should have seen how the 18 members of the Judiciary Committee operated for 5 or 6 days over a 2-week period of time. Everything was open. Everything was transparent. There was complete cooperation between the majority and the minority. And there's no reason why we can't do that out here in the United States Senate right now, and particularly at the beginning. This is a very provocative act.
Would the senator
Mr.
from Nevada
President,
yield?
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
provocative act? If my friend is so interested in regular order, why have we waited 3 months to go to conference on a budget? On a budget. That's regular order. Now suddenly, when it works to their advantage, I guess, they want to do away with the McConnell rule. What is the McConnell rule? 60 votes on everything.
Mr. President, the
Yes,
senator would
be happy to.
yield on that point. I was privileged in my capacity as President Pro Tem to speak to the graduating class of pages. The group of pages graduated just ahead of the distinguished group we have here now. And there had been discussion at that about immigration coming up. And then the distinguished Republican leader spoke and at great length went on to the pages about how these important issues must have 60 votes on everything. Must have 60 votes on amendments and so forth. And I'm sure the distinguished senator from Kentucky would confirm that that's what he said. Certainly there were 100 and some odd people in the room who heard him say it. And here we've offered, the distinguished majority leader has offered to have 3 Republican votes and 2 votes by Democratic senators, all under exactly the same rule, the rule that Senator McConnell proposed. we've talked and given great speeches that we've all given time and time and time and time again, both in the committee and on the floor. I'd like to just have voting on something so we can finish this because, frankly, given my choice of spending 4th of July week in Washington, salubrious as the weather is, or in Vermont for the 4th of July, I'd much rather be in Vermont.
Mr. President, I still have the floor.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I'm sorry that we've had this disagreement here, but I would say to everybody there are other ways of having simple majority votes, and if there's an objection to this, we have to go to that.
Mr. President,
The Senator from Alabama.
I would just note that Senator Grassley just offered to, in a few minutes to commence voting on 2 amendments